So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leslie Richards and I head up the CIPD in Wales. And I'm delighted to be hosting this afternoon session, which is part of our anti-racism stays on the agenda series of webinars. As you'll know, CIPD supported the government in its consultation on mandatory ethnicity pay reporting, an essential tool for employers looking to address ethnicity pay gaps in their workplace. Recent ONS data highlighted the importance of tackling inequalities, finding that most of the minority ethnic groups analysed earned less than white British employees in 2019. Employees are also increasingly keen to work for organisations that are taking action on inequalities. Today, I'm joined by a panel of experts who are going to look at different aspects of this topic, principles around which ethnicity pay data to report, the benefits for employers of addressing inequalities, and how to develop an action plan to address ethnicity pay gaps, including making a strong case for voluntary ethnicity pay reporting and securing senior leadership buy-in. So welcome to Charles Cotton, Senior Performance and Reward Advisor at CIPD, Sandra Kerr, Race Director, Business in the Community, and Raj Jones, Head of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion at Sodexo UK and Ireland. Thank you very much for taking the time out to join us this afternoon. Before we hear from our speakers, I just want to cover some practical details. The session is being recorded and will be available on demand via the webinar section of the CIPD website later on this afternoon, where you can access all previous webinar recordings and sign up for future ones. You'll see that you've all been muted. To submit questions to the panel, can you please use the Q&A box, not the chat box, because that won't be checked, but you can use the chat box to network with fellow attendees. And if you're going to do that, please remember to use the all panelists and attendees drop down to make sure you're sharing with everyone. I'd also like to draw your attention to some of our member benefits, and in particular, some of our additional resources you may already be aware of that can support you in your role. CIPD has a practical resource hub on the website dedicated to tackling racism in the workplace. We're adding resources to that all the time, including our latest guide for UK employers on the topic of ethnicity pay reporting, so please do check that out. And finally, CIPD members in the UK and Ireland can also access our new Wellbeing Hub and Helpline. Together with award-winning workplace wellbeing provider Health Assured, we now provide CIPD members with free help and support 24/7, 365 days a year via telephone or online consultations with qualified therapists. Members can access the phone number and the online services via the membership benefits webpage, and you'll see more details about this at the end of the session. So now we're going to move on to the content of this session. Charles will be offering the CIPD perspective and our calls for mandatory reporting. Sandra will then be delving more into the business case, so why it's important and the impact it can have. And then Raj will offer us a bit more of a practical case study into the approach that Sodexo took to reporting on ethnicity pay. We're then going to open up for questions, so please send these through as we go along, as they occur to you. We are going to aim to get through as many questions as possible. We may not be able to focus too much on individual questions, but what we'll try to do as we're going through is pick up on themes. So that's it from me for now, and I'm going to hand over to Charles to get us going. Thanks, Charles.
Thank you, Leslie, and good afternoon to everybody who's joined this webinar. I'm going to be briefly talking about the CIPD's position on ethnicity pay reporting. So in slide 2 of my presentation, it shows what the CIPD is calling for, which is that all large employers report pay by ethnicity, like how they disclose pay data by gender currently. And it also shows a copy of the guide that we came out with a few weeks ago, which is free to download from the CIPD website. Now, slide 3 of my presentation explains why we're calling for this. It's because we believe that pay disclosure, as well as narrative reporting and action plans, are important tools of an employer's fairness strategy. Now, I'm not going to go over the moral case and business advantages for creating a racially inclusive working environment. These have already been covered by previous CIPD webinars, as well as our own guide. So I'm going to focus on what we could be doing rather than why we should be doing it. The CIPD wants large employers to publish data, pay data by ethnicity. This is because we want to see the same level of corporate attention that's happened because of gender pay gap reporting that being given to this issue as well. The voluntary approach hasn't been working so far. Our research found that to date, just 13 of the UK's largest firms have reported on this issue, albeit this represents an increase of 6 on the previous year. This jump probably reflects a recognition of the increasing interest in this issue from stakeholders such as employees, customers, and investors. One possible explanation for the lack of action is that employers might not know how to go about collecting, analysing, and reporting pay information by ethnicity, or then to go on to write a narrative explaining why the figures are what they are and creating an action plan detailing the steps being taken to manage and mitigate these gaps. So to help, the CIPD has produced guidance, which I'll talk about shortly. However, as we recognise in my next slide, unless employers disclose this information, then many will not. Senior management will ask HR why it wants to put the organisation under the spotlight when others aren't. For this reason, we're calling on the government to legally require all large employers to disclose pay information by ethnicity from April 2023. This is something that many employers are already doing at the moment for gender pay gap reporting. In addition, we want the government to require employers to also produce a narrative and action plan. We want narratives and action plans because the figures are not an end in themselves, but a starting point for a conversation about why this situation exists and what can be done in response. It should be noted that large PLCs already have experience of writing a narrative when they explain their pay ratios between the CEO and their employees. While we recognize that how much a person gets paid doesn't reflect just what's going on in the workplace, for example, it can reflect schooling or the availability of childcare, an action plan will allow us to focus on what we can do rather than what we can't. Now, in slide 5 of my presentation, we look at how to help employers report their figures and take forward their fairness strategy. The CIPD has produced a guide. We didn't want perfect to be the enemy of good. By that, I mean that we were concerned that a focus on getting the perfect system for ethnicity pay reporting could divert attention away from the energy that actually was needed to actually do stuff, report ethnicity. So our guide recommends that employers follow gender pay gap reporting in terms of defining who to include and what to include and when to report, recognizing that gender pay gap reporting isn't perfect either. In addition, we recommend that employers produce 2 further statistics, namely the proportion of employers of an employer's workforce that have disclosed their ethnicity and the proportion of an employer's workforce that are from an ethnic minority. These 2 extra stats will help stakeholders to better understand the situation. For example, if 90% of the workforce have disclosed their ethnicity, then that pay data should be more reliable than if only 40% have. Similarly, if ethnic minorities make up 7% of an employer's workforce, then this stat can be useful when comparing to what's going on in the region where the employer is based. For example, how does this figure compare if the proportion of working adults from an ethnic minority in that area is 4% or 10%? In our guide, we cover both how to encourage more employers to disclose their ethnicity and how to drill down into the data, such as looking at it by various official ethnicity categories. We also look at the various benchmarks that you can use to assess your situation. Now, we recognise that ethnicity isn't just evenly distributed around the country, so in many instances, the data will be limited, and we would not encourage disclosing information that would help identify the remuneration of individuals. We also look at how to produce a narrative to accompany the numbers, explaining why the figures are what they are, and an action plan explaining what the employer intends to do over the coming years in terms of people management activity, such as reviewing its recruitment and selection approach or reviewing its benefits policy. Over time, we would like to see employers reporting on the reward outcomes for all their employees, so we can see, for example, the relationship between pay, ethnicity, and age. Now, the next slide of my presentation explores the 6 core principles our guide uses when selecting the most appropriate information to include in ethnicity pay reports. Briefly, these are: 1, align ethnicity pay reporting with gender pay gap reporting, but recognize the differences. This will help minimize the additional work and bureaucracy for HR and payroll, but there are differences in reporting on ethnicity which will need to reflect, most notably the larger number of categories required beyond the male-female groupings on gender. Secondly, ethnicity representation is important as and strongly linked to ethnicity pay gaps. So we recommend that employers report on their ethnicity group representation breakdowns in each quartile, as well as their pay gaps by quartile, which many employers are already doing voluntarily on gender. Recognize the value and simplicity, recognize the value of simplicity and clarity. While a single gender pay gap figure can be criticized for providing no indication of how it can be reduced, it has been very successful in securing attention and action. Fourthly, focusing on action. Data and analysis are interesting and necessary, but only insofar as they support effective action to address any gaps identified. Fifthly, start and improve. Employers vary in their experience, ability, and the resources they can devote to ethnicity pay reporting. Our recommendations focus on what we believe employers should be able to calculate and analyze, while suggesting more detailed categories, breakdowns, and actions that could be done. Finally, combine comparability in data with tailoring of analysis and actions. There should be a minimum of core information communicated in every employee's annual ethnicity pay report. However, additional analysis, such as by detailed ethnicity category, by stage in the employment cycle, by ethnicity and gender, etc., is crucial for employers to fully understand and address any ethnicity pay gaps evident in the statistics. Finally, my final slide reveals our public policy calls for government. We want government to require all large employers to report on pay by ethnicity, as they already do, by gender from April 2023. We want this because relying on employers to do this voluntarily will only result in a few employers taking this issue seriously. We want more employers to be required to publish a narrative and an action plan explaining the situation and what the steps they are going to take in the future, both for ethnicity pay reporting and gender pay gap reporting. This will allow employees, investors, and customers to assess the commitment of the employer to managing, developing, and rewarding people in a fair way and tackling discrimination and disadvantage. Overall, we recognize the complexities involved, but just because something is hard doesn't mean you should avoid doing it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles. Before we move on to Sandra, who's going to look more at the business case, why it's important, and the impact that ethnicity pay reporting can have, I can just see there's one question in the chat which would be useful to take now. It's an easy one, honest. What is considered to be a large employer in terms of headcount? So I guess we're going to keep referring to large employer through the rest of the session. So.
Yes, at the moment, the gender pay gap report requirements, as well as the CEO pay ratio requirements, apply to large organizations, and those are those with 250 and or more employees. So that's our definition, and it's the official definition used by the Government's Office for National Statistics.
Okay, so Sandra, we're going to come to you now for you to tell us a little bit more about how we should be doing it and why we should be doing it.
Thank you very much, Leslie. Thank you for the opportunity to talk this afternoon about ethnicity pay gap reporting. I feel like this has been going on for a long time. So just a bit of a story. In 2015, we published the Race at Work survey. We launched it in celebration of 20 years of action on race at business and the community. And we wanted to get some evidence really to help employers think about progression. Because many were saying, well, even if we get, ethnic minorities in the workplace, we really struggle to progress them to senior levels. So the survey was written very much with progression in mind to try and understand what are the challenges. What we found from that survey was when we asked the question of ethnic minority people, so Black, Asian, mixed race, all ethnically diverse people, 70% said they really wanted to progress. But when we look at organizations' representation, they tend to be at the bottom. We also looked at the educational profile. We found they were more likely to have degrees, PhDs. So there was energy and drive to do the right thing, but no evidence of that changing. So that was the first kind of shocker, that there was such a strong drive to progress. But it wasn't realized in the workplace. We also found out things about people's desire for mentors, sponsors, fast track. So again, huge willingness to put the work in, but still not working. And one of the calls for action we made in 2015 was the government to do a review on race in the labour market. What we saw at the time was the Davis review was underway. Gender pay gap reporting was, kind of pretty well in the bag, and nothing much was happening on ethnicity. Baroness McGregor Smith, who was chairing the Women in Business Council, we were asking, can we use a similar model? We didn't even say her, but we said, along those lines. She was commissioned to do the McGregor Smith review. I think probably the best person at the time. She was one of, and still is, probably the only ethnically diverse woman at the head of a FTSE organization, and came with it very much from a business perspective and consulted widely. We worked closely with her. She had worked with us before in BITC. So we used the survey to help her shape what that review would look like, which was why the Race at Work survey is a perfect national benchmark, really, to hear the voices of employees on this. And the data is telling us that people want to feel valued, they want to feel included, they want to be paid and feel like they're being paid at the right amount. And that's part of it. So one of the big findings from that review was 24 billion per annum would be the economic boost to the UK economy if we could tackle those disparities. And that would include people being promoted, recruited, progressed, paid at the right amounts. And we know that when we think about the demographic shift that we will find out in April 22, what that actually looks like, that when we track progress, we'd also be thinking about that 24 billion becoming even a larger amount. So good for the UK and good for the economy. And right now in the bouncing back, we want to bounce back better, of course, and inclusively, and potentially we can spring forward financially by tackling all these labour market disparities. Why would we not do that? So really important. And then the second thing I think that has come to the fore actually through the pandemic is with the disproportionate impact on ethnic minority communities, it has flagged where maybe sectors are overrepresented. And I would say employers need to look at what I'd call internal occupational segregation to look at where employees are deployed within their organizations, because often if they're not in the high-paying springboard roles, those will affect the results as to pay gaps and progression. And of course, this is not a silver bullet. We know, so this, the delay, why it's difficult and it's complex. We know this. That's not an excuse not to progress. Look at the pandemic, that was difficult. We didn't say, oh, let's not do anything because it's terrible. We now have a vaccine and trying to kind of navigate our way out of it. I think what really matters is that we actually demonstrate that this matters and we are committed to taking action. And I commend the CIPD for saying, actually, let's put the guide out, let's do the alignment to gender. Many employers are doing it anyway. It doesn't need to be an exact science, because we know when we think about the whole challenge of progression in the workplace, challenge of retention, having the culture right, there is not a silver bullet. There's not one measure that you can take. You need to take a basket of measures. But this one is really important because it's a big indicator of the economic health that of your employees and how you are contributing to those and not. I do want to flag a couple of other things that, as I say, have come to light more so with the pandemic, when we started talking about economic downturn and some of those challenges. When we had the last one in 2008, 2 years on, Black and Asian people, only 60% had no savings at all. Much higher housing costs, particularly from people from Black representation, and some communities with multi-generational households. Lots of invisible things going on in the workplace. People don't need to not be paid the right amount to. So it really matters that we get this right for not only fairness, but just, just humanity, really, to ensure people are getting the right pay that they need. So some things for employers also to think about is obviously diversity, what I call diversity in design, conversations that need to have the right people around the right table at the time, at the right time. And I would say that needs to be in any action plan and narrative, what an employer is doing to do that. And where you can, I think when you're pulling together your ethnicity pay data, is have diverse people around the table involved, looking at the data, looking at the narrative, talking about the stories. What is the impact? How are we going to make progress so that the organization is seen to be taking this seriously? There's another note that I was thinking about, things that I think really matter with employers. So recruitment is one. So Charles already talks about demographic data for local to benchmark against. There are stubborn disparities in the labour market about how people access work, but also I think employers, as part of their plan, need to build in retention strategies to ensure that people who start, if you're all graduates, you start on the right pay. So tracking that, and also whatever you need to do to invest in the software or the data to ensure that you can actually track the progress of your pay gaps as you go, and think about what the impact of new hires that will do on the data, because we know it can be skewed if you could have lots of people, and I think Charles kind of alluded to this, working in your organization. So you might have great representation, but if they're all at the bottom, and you might have a 2% pay gap, but who cares if there's no one at the top? So it really matters that when you're telling the story, you're as transparent as possible in painting the picture about where you are and where you need to be. And I would say the really important stakeholders, obviously the HR professionals here, your talent management, your learning development, your employee resource groups, all of those people need to be consulted around the table to be assured that you are on the right track with what you're doing, and that you're being as transparent as possible. And where we are at the moment, so with business in the community, so the McGregor-Smith review, we ran the 2018 survey, which unearthed that 11% of employers were publicly declaring capturing their ethnicity data. We have a Race at Work survey report coming out in October, where we will be able to produce some progress on that. Not the way it needs to be, because mandatory reporting is the only way we're going to get 100% responsiveness on this. But we also, it's going to demonstrate evidence on some of the other kind of key issues. And I think if I was going to talk about why do I care about this, why do I think it matters, it's because it will bring this to the attention of leaders at the top table. Have to talk about it every year at least. And you can't just wait until that year. You have to talk about it in year to discuss what do the numbers look like, why are they like that, what are we going to do. And I think we are currently working with BASE to work on voluntary guidance, interestingly in response to the CRED report, for everybody to increase their ethnicity pay gap reporting, and we'll update you in due course on that. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Sandra. I can see the questions are flying in, so keep those going. So the final presentation from our panel is from Raj Jones, who's going to tell us how this works in practice. So over to you, Raj.
Thank you. So I'm Raj Jones, and I head up diversity, equity and inclusion for Sodexo UK and Ireland. And we published our ethnicity pay report for the first time this year alongside our gender pay report. And I'm just going to share some of our practical lessons from pulling the data through to publishing and what we've learned along the way, and some reflections as well. First of all, just a little bit about Sodexo, because we're not necessarily a well-known brand, though we are a very large international organisation. So we provide services across 3 areas: on-site services, so that could be your schools, universities, sport and sporting venues, hospitals, etc. We also provide benefits in ward services and personal and home care services. So we do hard and soft events, your cleaning and catering, and also property maintenance, for example. In 2020, 19.3 billion euro in consolidated revenues. We employ globally 420,000 employees, and in the region I'm responsible for UK and Ireland, that's 30,000, 28,000 which are in the UK, who we're reporting on for our pay reporting purposes. We operate in 64 countries, and we serve approximately 100 million consumers a day. So we at Sodexo in the UK have been a strong advocate and a strong believer in the benefits of reporting from early onset. Next slide, please. Now, we believe transparency is a good thing and it drives progress. We've been very vocal in our support and made a number of public commitments to reporting, predominantly back in 2019. So we've mentioned our own public sector pledge. We've won a centuries for the Business and Community Ways at Work Charter. And we've also worked very closely with another organisation called Empower in signing the ethnicity pay mandate, calling for it to be a legislative requirement. And following the Black Lives Matter protests from the murder of George Floyd last summer, we signed an open letter in the Sunday Times, recognising we've got more to do in the space and we're really going to up our efforts, essentially. But why report now? Move on to the next slide. I think 2 key reasons: progress over perfection. We need better data. Our disclosure rate is 75%. We are running an employee census at some point this year to get better data, but actually why wait? And we need to start somewhere. By doing so, it shows how we're performing currently and enables us to pinpoint where our systems and processes are not operating in an equitable way, so that we can redesign this for everyone's benefit. And as I said, we believe transparency is good. It promotes action internally and it encourages constructive collective dialogue externally, as we're doing today. Next slide, please. So we use the same methodology as gender pay. We have in the past supported governments testing different methodologies, but we thought this was the right method to take, and we've done give us a good insight into where we're at currently. Obviously, we only can do the analysis based on those that shared their ethnicity, so anyone hasn't been taken out of the data sets. So that's our report is based on a 75% disclosure rate. We chose not to just do white versus BAME, recognising that can hide disparities amongst different ethnic groups, and therefore have compared the earnings and pay gaps of white colleagues against black colleagues, and again against Asian colleagues, and again mixed ethnic colleagues as well, to really drill down on our data and see what it's telling us. For gender pay, we are required to report against 5 legal entities for gender. We can't do that, unfortunately, at the moment for ethnicity because our disclosure rates vary from entity to entity. So one legal entity at the moment currently has a 14% disclosure rate. That data set is too small. That's a risk of identifying people and also skewing the data. So for purposes of ethnicity pay, we have pulled all the entity data together and produced the overall figures. Next slide, please. Just how we thought it'd be helpful to look at the makeup of our organisation and how we compare to the external market. We're actually in a very fortunate position that our Black and Asian minority ethnic population is 14% overall and 61% white. That is high, it's above the UK labour market of 12.8%. But actually, when you look at where those people are in our business, they are unfortunately concentrated in the lower paid roles. around 20% are in our frontline positions, as we call them. As we move up into management and senior leadership positions, as you see in other organisations, that drops off dramatically. And then you'll see the comparisons versus all the different ethnic groups as well. It gives a really good benchmark of where we're at the moment. Next slide, please. Interestingly, because of where we have concentration and also where we have gaps in our data for our senior leaders, both our mean and median pay gaps were actually quite small. And for some groups, we actually reported a positive pay gap. As I say, this represents over-representation on frontline, around 20%, and under-representation in management and senior leadership, so 2%. What we did find a big gap, understandably and expectably so, was around our bonus pay gap. So across all ethnic groups, when comparing it to white colleagues, there's a 50% bonus pay gap, which is huge. We did try and run a report and look at the numbers just for our top 140 leaders, but we found such a small data set to skew the data and didn't give you reliable results. Plus, given the low representation in our top leadership, that was a real risk of identifying people as well. So it's not something we could publish externally, but something we can use internally to help us form our action plans. As the requirement to publish ethnicity pay figures is voluntary, we don't feel there's reliable external data that we can benchmark against, but we are committed to publishing going forward every year in line with gender, so at least we'll have our own internal benchmarks to see how we're progressing. I think we've also been very careful, given the gaps that we have in disclosure, these numbers may not be a true reflection, and therefore careful narrative is required, as it could fluctuate year on year. The nature also of our business is that we win business, we lose business, we have people coming in and out of organisation all the time, and that quality of the data can vary with trooping staff over as well. So yes, it looks great, and our pay gaps are quite small, but are they really true reflection? And actually, let's be prepared for them to go up rather than down as well. So being very careful in our narrative. Next slide, please. So what have been our lessons and reflections from going through this process, which took us several months, I would say, and a lot of to and froing as well, before we felt really comfortable to go ahead and report. Some leaders and stakeholders will be uncomfortable with reporting. That's to be expected. It's not a reason not to do it, but work with them, bring them along the process, explain the data, and where the pinch points are, and what the data is showing. You've got to start somewhere. You know, we want to improve our disclosure rate. We're going to be doing employee census, but we know we're never going to get 100% data for ethnicity. That's unrealistic. We look at some of the best practice from other organisations. Their disclosure rate's around 85% to 90%. You want to aspire to that, but we'll never get 100%. So let's not wait. Let's start making some progress. We found it really helpful in terms of getting external guidance and endorsement. So business community, for example, other partners, other organisations that have published as well, looking at their data, how they're presenting their data, what their findings have been really beneficial, and so the journey they've been on. Really partner with key people internally, so raw team obviously in terms of crunching the numbers and understanding the detail behind the numbers. Our Origins Employee Network is our ethnicity network as well, so really help working with them in how we communicate the findings of that report and actually what that means for us going forward. It's also really important other people in the business can talk about the report and articulate it. So there's a lot of time worked by HR leadership team so they can really understand it and explain where our pinch points are, where we've got opportunities to close the gaps as well. And really critical that we work with internal comms and PR team as well to tell the narrative and tell the story. We're one of the first in our industry to publish, but we don't want to pat the back. We want to be quite humble because we know we've got work to do. So we're very careful in the narrative and story we're putting out there. It's not a celebratory thing. We've got issues, we've got problems we need to fix. This puts a spotlight on it, what we're going to do about it, and let's be truthful and authentic in our messaging is really important. Really important that we focus on internal comms as well in particular. So we published internally first of all. As I say, we didn't want it to be a PR exercise and spent a lot of time and investment to really explain what the data was saying. So I filmed some short explainer videos about the figures and what it's saying. So I used the example for every £1 a white person earns, our black colleague earns 95p, for example. And like doing that for all the different ethnic groups and just really break it down, make it really simple. Because this isn't everyone's everyday language. If you don't sit in HR reward, really helping people in our business understand it, particularly given the focus in the last 12 months around racism and exclusion. Tell them the pay gap as well. That's not going to be helpful in terms of their experience. So really invest in your people. I also found it's really important to remind people it's not about equal pay analysis. We have separate processes in place to make sure people pay equally and fairly for doing the same roles. This is a separate analysis, separate data. It's really important that we have an action plan in place that's owned and understood by the business. It doesn't just sit myself or the board team. This change is going to happen when it's owned by the business, and the business understands what they need to do and what their role is in that from the top down. So really, as well as presenting the figures, presenting what are we going to do to change that, and actually focusing on representation and the employee experience is where we need to put attention. It's not just about getting better numbers, it's about the experience. Otherwise people just leave. So it's not a numbers game. And if we do all those things, that in turn close the gap, but let's focus on that, not the gap itself. And we have future aspirations to overlay the gender and ethnicity data and then to extend to other demographics like age, as Charles mentioned as well. This is just a starting point for us, but we felt it's helped communicate our intention, our authenticity, and to be transparent and to recognise we've got work to do, but we also are very committed to change as well. If we just go on to the final slide, we have, alongside the paper, published our action plan in regards to ethnicity, which comes under 3 key buckets. So ensuring leadership team is engaged and held accountable. So we are going to be setting targets to improve the representation of Black, Asian and minority ethnic individuals in management and leadership positions. We will develop a scorecard to track and measure that progress, and we will make sure there's education and learning to underpin that as well. We want to support the attraction, development and growth of our people. So we are reviewing our processes and policies, understanding where there are some blockages, biases that are stopping people from coming to work for us or progressing, and what we can do to remove those. Targeted development programs such as mentoring, coaching and sponsorship are in place and will continue to be a key priority, as well as career pathways. As I mentioned before, we've got great diversity in our frontline population, but they're not progressing through the organisation. So how can we help them? What are the blockages? How can we give them clear guidance and pathways to develop in our business? And profiling role models and network opportunities so people can see the people like themselves in the business at all levels is really critical. And last thing, but really importantly, elevating the voices of our people. So we run a series of listening sessions following George Floyd's murder. We need to continue to do that and continue to listen to our people, respond to what they're telling us. And also storytelling lived experiences, make sure people can understand what people's lived experiences are, enabling that safe space, psychological safety for open dialogue and positive intent, and education and learning to underpin all this is really, really important. So those have been our experiences. I think overall it's been received really well that we've done this, but it can't be a talking shop. People want to see action, people want to see what we're going to do that in turn will close the gaps that we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Raj. Thanks for that. So we're moving into the Q&A session now. We've got quite a few here. So I can see 2 in the Q&A box, which I'm going to link. Somebody has pointed out that there needs to be an exception added to GDPR because as of now, no one in Europe can actually file the ethnicity of their employees, and asking how we would go about that. But there's a question connected to that. So I don't know how you feel, Charles, about taking this one. I'm keen to understand how this initiative will be guided by the CIPD on the requirements for organisations to carry out data protection impact assessments prior to conducting any ethnicity pay analyses.
Well, the GDPR doesn't stop organisations from asking this information to be disclosed. What is GDPR does have restrictions on how you can use it in terms of, I suppose, potentially doing analysis which then could identify an individual. And of course, you know, we wouldn't want that because it would be against GDPR. Secondly, if you are collecting this information, you have to kind of collect it in a safe way. and you have to be able to store it in a safe way. But again, you ask or you capture a lot of personal information anyway from in payroll systems and HR systems. So the way that you are collecting and storing this information is not going to be significantly different from the other data that you are collecting and storing anyway. I think what's important is explain to people why you are collecting this information. It's to help the organization ensure that the way it recruits people or selects people, trains and develops them and rewards them is fair. And ethnicity is one lens that you're going to be using to evaluate that. Gender is another, but over time, hopefully, as you get better information, you'll be able to look at other characteristics. So, for instance, caring. If you've got an elder caring responsibility or childcare responsibility, what kind of impact does that have on how you are, rewarded and recognised in the organisation, or the training and opportunities that are, available to you?
Thank you.
Just jump in here.
Sorry, Sandra. Yes, come on.
Yeah. So the GDPR in April this year, we did a piece with Hogan Lovells law firm, and they did for legal counsels, and they did some myth-busting around GDPR. So people want to, because they would be the ones that would stop you. The legal kind of advice that you have in organizations. So they put something together with us to actually help employers understand that they don't have to be afraid of that. And I have spoken to BEIS officials, ONS officials, Cabinet Office, and everybody said, oh, no, that we've been around the houses, that's not the thing. So I think we can be assured that there is a way to do this properly. And I think Charles has already set that out. But if the legal firms say it's okay, you can be assured that it's okay.
Yeah, for us at Sodexo, we're writing justifications for each category of data we want to capture and how we're going to use the data. So there is ways we can do it, absolutely. Thank
you, everybody. There's another question, and again, there's two questions linked around the same thing, which I know we have touched on. I think all three panelists have touched on this, but somebody has said in the chat, in the Q&A, SMEs make up around 99.9% of all businesses in the UK, so are enormously important to the UK economy, and 96% of the UK's businesses have fewer than 10 employees. There are only 13,000 businesses registered in the UK that fit the definition of the size that CIPD is calling for this to apply to, so any results are only going to be indicative, not definitive. And I think all three of you touched on that. There is a specific question, again, around the capturing of the data. Since data is voluntary, how does enforcing such reporting take into account these disparate facts? Raj, I can see you nodding. Do you want to take that question?
Yeah, I think we just got to be very transparent when we're reporting what is the data based on. We're not going to get 100%, as I mentioned, so it's always voluntary, but I think it comes back to when you're asking for the data, trying to build that culture of trust and help you understand why you're asking for the data and how it's going to be beneficial. So we're being very clear that's going to help us target our interventions much more closely and be much more measurable in what we're trying to do. So I think building that culture of trust is critical, but also be realistic. I don't think any organisation's got 100% disclosure rates.
Sandra, Charles, any?
Yeah, capturing ethnicity data, and the top of my list ahead here was trust. I think there's something about transparency. So frequently asked questions when people do ask, so what's going to happen with my data? Being as transparent, putting it out there on your internal platforms. This is what happens. This is who has access. This is how we're going to use it. I think also incentives. Employers have used incentives, donating to people's charities and things to get them to fill it out, because sometimes it's just about, I need to get around and do that, opposed to I have an opposition to it. And also getting multiple stakeholders involved. Some people will be inspired by the leader saying this is really important. Some will be inspired by the network, by the trade unions, or different actors within this kind of whole ecosystem that you can use to say, yeah, this really, why this matters, and the power of story. So people telling stories as to actually why this has happened and how it really affects people's real lives. And the power of data. If the data is not there, how can we even, improve what we feel is or perceive as a problem. So I think that the messaging around why is really important, being open and transparent and demonstrating that actually the leaders really care about this. And, you know, they keep celebrating the drumbeat of progress. So, you know, Raj, you talk about, you know, the impossibility of 100, but some have got like 90, up into the high 90s now. And, you know, one organization, I know they had like 26% and really did internal campaign to say, you see how great we are on gender? We want to be great on ethnicity too, is why we want your numbers. You know, so really just, you know, being open and saying, look, people might think, oh, you only do gender. It's like, well, we've got the numbers and look what we do, and we know we want to do this on gender, we want to do this on ethnicity, we want to do this on disability. So part of that, building that, and that links to the people feeling like, okay, then you really care about me, I'm going to trust you, I'm going to give you my data to help you become the best organization in the world.
Thank you, Sandra. We've got a question around transparency in the public sector. So NHS employs over 1.4 million people and is doing great work on reporting on race pay disparity through the Workforce Race Equality Standard. Civil service employs 500,000 people and is not doing so well on transparency reporting. And the question is, and maybe Sandra, I can direct this one to you, is it time for government to be an exemplar through modelling greater transparency in the public sector?
Absolutely, we need to be walking the talk on this, because, you know, the public duty requires them to be as transparent as possible about who's employed, what people are paid, and it is important. And I would say, but let's not use that as an excuse for them to say, okay, let's get our house in order, let's take 5 years before we then ask the private sector. What this needs is public sector, voluntary sector, third sector, and private sector, everybody together. It is time. And as I say, back to the size of the prize, if we can improve this, it actually improves not everybody in everybody's working lives, but also the economy as well. So yeah, I mean, there's no point trying to say, oh no, they're too busy. No, they need to be upfront, walking the talk, and that would start with, I would start with House of Commons, House of Lords, all of them. You know, let's get some transparency going.
There's one question in the box, and then I've got two more here, which would neatly finish us up. So let's take the question in the Q&A box. Can the panel share their thoughts on the use of the language acronym BAME? It is used in the CIPD guide and it's being talked about on this call today, but this colleague is saying she's more recently heard that we should be referring to just minority ethnic. Raj, do you want to start on that one?
Yeah, for me, I try and avoid the collective use of the term BAME because it can hide disparities, and try and be wherever possible very specific in what group I'm referring to. And if I can't spell out in full, then use the acronym. I also try and avoid using the term minority ethnic because sometimes the word minority can just highlight the exclusion and what they're already feeling as well, and talk about mixed ethnic groups as well. I think it's context, why you're referring to BAME, what is it referring, why you're referring to BAME, but where you can be very specific, especially I think when you're doing things like pay reporting, because otherwise if you do white versus BAME, that will hide disparities, as we found. Look at representation, that will hide disparities. So I think where possible, be very specific would be my advice.
Okay, thanks. Charles, there's one in here now around the split for reporting, which is white and BAME. It would be helpful, asks Kate Richards, if we could know the split for accuracy of reporting year on year as people are starting to actually do this work. Any views, any advice?
Well, the CIPD, you know, we're not being definitive about the information that organisations should report in their narrative. But as I mentioned in our guiding, partly, as Sandra mentioned, one of the recommendations from the CRED review was that BEIS would come up with its own guidance. So we didn't want to kind of come up with guidance saying this is the way you should be doing it, and then BEIS a few months later, hopefully, would then come up with another set of guidance which would be totally different from what we were suggesting. That said, there's only a certain number of ways you can kind of analyze or report this data. So hopefully any change, any guidance from BEIS would be massively different to what we're suggesting now. But yes, I mean, one of the additional statistics would be saying, well, this is the proportion of the workforce in our organisation that's from an ethnic minority, and you should also, by asking people to give their their ethnicity, you should be able to work out what proportion are British white, or what proportion of that. So there's nothing to stop you kind of going in more granular. It's just that we wanted something to try and just jumpstart activity, because at the moment I think people are getting so concerned about doing it perfect that actually nothing really is happening, and you think, well, you've got to start somewhere. Let's start with this. And I don't think anybody's going to be saying, well, they've done it the wrong way or they've done it the right way. It's just to just start thinking in your organization, let's have a look at what, do gaps exist, and if so, why? And we recognize that it may not be anything necessarily to do with the workplace. It may be what's going out in society as well. But unless you start attempting to kind of evaluate the figures, we're not going to get anywhere. I think you might be on mute, Leslie.
I'm on mute because it's quite, it sounded like, I don't know, a Spitfire going down my road a minute ago, so quickly went off. So I'm going to address this one to Raj, because you have, shared with us how you've gone about ethnicity pay reporting, and you said that you'd also done the gender reporting. Now, do you think that large employers should go beyond gender and ethnicity to review how they're doing when it comes to other protected characteristics?
In principle, yes, absolutely. I think we need to broaden the focus, and we need to be intersectional with our focus as well, not look at those in isolation and overlay data where possible. Yeah, I think, as I say, it helps identify where your challenges are, pinch points are, and drives dialogue progress.
Sandra, do you want to add anything on that point?
Yeah, I mean, can I say, look, I'm sure people are using software to calculate these pay gaps. So yes, please, let's go intersectional. Let's use, let's monitor by characteristic. The biggest challenge is getting your employers to trust you that you're actually really going to use it for some great stuff. And as soon as you can, showcase what you've been able to learn through insight to get people enthused and encouraged about it. But yes, because the whole agenda, it is about inclusion, and that means including people when we talk about being paid the right amounts, no matter what their characteristics. So absolutely.
Thank you. Just before I ask this final question, I can see that some colleagues have dropped some really useful links that are relevant to some of the questions that we've had this afternoon, and some of the answers. Those have gone into the chat. So if you're not keeping an eye on that, there are some useful links there, including the question we asked a few minutes ago about writing and talking about ethnicity and race. So we've got time for just this one last question, and I don't know where I'm going to send this one, but it kind of squares the circle and brings us back to where we started. What do you think, all three panelists, are the chances of large employers being required to disclose pay data by ethnicity within the next few years? Sandra, you're on the spotlighted at the moment. You can go first.
I think the writing's on the wall, in that it's going to happen, because it makes sense. The business, community have said yes. Everybody realizes that this is the right thing to do. In stages, yes, but I can't see this ever people saying, oh, well, just forget it, because actually, if anything, there's going to be a greater call for more characteristics to be covered. So I think it's just a case of when, rather than if.
Great. So our time is actually up there, unless Charles and Raj have anything to add to that, that last question.
All I was going to
Charles?
add that you are seeing it pushes anyway. I mean, you've got employees are looking for this information. You've got investors are looking for this information. You've got customers. And whilst, you know, the present government hasn't shown much activity, there's stuff going out in, you know, in the nations. I mean, look at what's going on in Scotland, look what's going on in Wales. You know, you probably know about all the initiatives that Mark Drakeford has launched in Wales and around this topic. So progress is being made.
Great, thank you. So it amazes me how we always end up, no matter how many questions we've got and how many people we've got talking, we always end up bang on time with an hour. So well done there, everybody. Thank you to our experts. Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Raj. And thank you, Charles. I'm sure you'll agree they have given us a lot to think about and a lot of really good guidance and pointers as to how to go about this. Thanks to everyone who submitted a question. We got through them all as hopefully gave you the answers you were looking for. The recording is going to be available on demand later, and the link to that was posted in the chat. But if you missed that, it's on the webinar page of the website, and the slides will also be available. And then a final reminder about the wellbeing support for members in UK and Ireland, the telephone helpline, as provided by Health Assured, and of course the Tackling Racism in the Workplace Hub. Other than that, thank you very much for joining us. Look forward to seeing you again, and have a good afternoon, everybody. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.